Radio Free Palmer 89.5 KVRF presents Mushing Radio, hosted by Robert Forto. Mushing Radio is about dog-powered sports, living in the Great White North, and mushing. Visit our website at mushingradio.com. Here is your host, Robert Forto.
Hello and welcome, everybody. This is Robert Forto, and you're listening to Day 10 coverage of the 2021 Iditarod here on Dogworks Radio. You can hear all of our episodes over on dogworksradio.com, as well as KVRF 89.7 in the Matsu Valley, radiofreepalmer.org. And tonight, I am joined by my two co-hosts, Tony Ryder, calling in from Kenai, Alaska, and Alex Stein, calling in from Southern California. Tony, how's it going tonight?
Not too bad.
Thank you for being on. And Alex, how are things in California?
Things in California are pretty good. We had some much needed rain, which is not something you want up there, but it's something we need badly down here. And I am just very excited because there's a lot of stuff that happened that we're going to talk about, and I can't wait to get to it.
Yeah, we have a lot of news and notes that happened over the last 24 hours. Of note, we have 21 finishers that have crossed the finish line in Deschka Landing, with about 15 or so to go on the trail, and they should be finishing up in the next couple of days, and we will be on until the last one is in. So if you want to make sure you catch those episodes, be sure to subscribe to our podcast. So let's start off with the first story of the day, and that is about the belt buckle. What do you know about that, Alex?
So usually you get a belt buckle when you finish your first Iditarod, and no matter how many other Iditarods you finish, you only get that one belt buckle. But this year, because it's a very different race and it's a different trail that's never been run before, the Iditarod made the decision that they were going to give everyone who finishes this year a special belt buckle that has a slightly different design, commemorating the fact that this was run on the Gold Loop Trail. So it's kind of cool because a lot of finishers who got their belt buckle last year or the year before, or sometimes decades ago, are going to get a new belt buckle for this year.
And I'm sure you remember this story, Alex, but several years ago when we had the first fire up here in Willow, and sadly Dee Dee Genro lost her home in the blaze. She went out and found her belt buckle, if I remember correctly, in the ashes. Is that right?
Yeah, she found it, and I think it had been mostly destroyed, and I believe that the Iditarod made an exception and gave her a new one to make up for the one that had been burned.
And these belt buckles, guys, they are very similar to the big rodeo belt buckles that they wear. They're the cherished memento of Iditarod. I mean, they're not nearly as gaudy as the rodeo ones, but these guys wear these with real pride. You will see guys that finished the Iditarod 20 or 30 years ago still wearing these belt buckles, don't you?
Yeah, and people are very, very proud of them. And they are sometimes, because it is so difficult to complete your qualifiers and get into Iditarod and then run the race, they're sometimes referred to as the world's most expensive belt buckles.
Right. So, Tony, our next story has to do with Ali Zirkle. I know you talked a little bit about this on Twitter this morning or this afternoon. What can you tell us about her progress and her announcement?
Sure. So Ali went on her blog last night and gave a little bit of an update on how she is doing. She probably had a little bit of help just knowing what she reported, but she updated saying that she wanted to say how she was doing, but also what she remembered about the accident, which isn't much. She remembers that it happened right after she got out of the gorge. She said she flipped her sled, and she said she remembers a hard impact to her head, seeing black, and then severe pain in her right shoulder, which we now know is that it was dislocated. And then, of course, she drove the 5 miles with her dog team to the checkpoint of Roan. She doesn't remember much about the checkpoint or the flight to the hospital. She does tell a story about how when she was in the checkpoint, she could hear people talking in the cabin that she was in, and she thought they were talking about a dog needing to be medevaced. The way she wrote that part, I'm still not sure if it was actually a dog they were talking about or if she, in just her confused state, was thinking she was the dog. She says she doesn't remember much, if anything, about the hospital. She's home now. She's being well taken care of by her husband, Alan, and their team. She says, what did she say here? She said as for how she's doing, she has sensitivity to light and sound and hasn't been outside. But her husband, Alan, has given her minute-to-minute updates on the race. She did, even though the computer really hurts to look at, she did get on and watch Dallas Seavey and Aaron Burmeister in the checkpoint of Squentna, and which I thought was really kind of sweet for her to say, because Dallas, in his post-race interview, said that it felt wrong that Allie was not there with him and Aaron in Squentna. So it's kind of like, well, she was there, just not the way you wanted her to be. And then she made sure to let everybody know that she was so very thankful for their messages of love and support at this time. So it's just nice to know that Allie is, she's up and about as much as she can be, but it does sound, not being a medical person myself, but it sounds like it's a pretty severe concussion. She did say that on her ride into Rhone, she was vomiting. So sounds like a pretty serious concussion.
Right. And Alex, a few years ago, I'm sure you remember when Brent Sass had a pretty bad fall from this sled on the Yukon Quest. And he fell off the sled in the middle of the night, and I believe he got a pretty bad concussion as well. And for the next few years, I don't know if this year included, he wore a helmet on the trail. And also, at around the same time, a lot of folks started wearing helmets on Iditarod because it was supposed to be really rough conditions on that section of the trail from Rainy Pass to Finger Lake and onto Rhone. And several people not only wore helmets, but they also wore hockey pads because of that. Do you recall that?
I do. And, it's one of these things that I think we don't think about so much until something like this happens. But, when I was a kid, nobody wore helmet. No, non-professional, non-racing skiers wore helmet. And now it's very, very common. I think it's not a bad idea. And I would be in favor of more people wearing helmets. I don't know that it should be a rule, but I think it would certainly protect a lot of people if they would wear helmets.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, because this is one of the big names in the sport, if you will, that this happened to. So we'll see if anything comes of it. As they do in the NFL, they always talk about rule changes in the offseason, and more we talk about on this show how Iditarod is now a year-round sport. There's something happening all the time, where it's volunteer meetings or picnics or whatever in non-COVID times, as we should say, but it's becoming a year-round sport for sure. So the next story, Alex, is a story about Ryan Olson. We profiled her earlier in the coverage for our nightly Musher profile, but you have a really cool story about what happened when she finished.
Yeah, so Ryan has been sending out, or her team has been sending out, these great trail updates every day or every other day. And there was one that I got shortly before we came on the air. Of course, she's finished by now. And she had 12 dogs in harness when she finished. And there were 2 dogs, Uno and Bowser, who had been dropped earlier. And her handlers, and this is possible, I think, because we had the loop this year rather than finishing in Nome. So her dogs were flown back to Anchorage, and her handlers took Uno and Bowser up to Deshka Landing to meet Ryan and the rest of her team and sort of reunite these dogs with their teammates when she came in. And I just, we talk a lot about the camaraderie and the team of these canine athletes. And I just think it was really cool that they thought to bring these two dogs who had been separated from the other 12 to reunite with them at the finish line.
And did they put them in harness or anything as they brought him back, or just hang out with the team?
I think they just hung out.
Wow. That's a really cool story. And sadly, Alex and Tony, we've been getting a lot of negative comments. And this is really the first time this year that we've gotten a lot of negative comments. And they're all seem to be on YouTube about how this is cruel and abusive and all of that towards the dogs. And we haven't seen that before. And this is our 10th year of doing this, but this is a story that is a real testament of it being all about the dogs, isn't it, Alex?
Yeah, it really is. And, I think that YouTube is probably a little bit more friendly towards people who, I'll just say, do not know very much about the sport or about Iditarod and are just on this bandwagon that's being pushed by certain I'll just say radical animal rights activists, and it's sort of a shame because there is so much great dog care, and these dogs are so well cared for and so happy when they get to run, and it's really very much the opposite of what a lot of these people are saying.
Right. And there's another story in regard to that dog care. We talked about Dakota Schlossler earlier in our coverage, and you guys had him as Rookie of the Year, but I would venture to guess he may be up for the Sportsmanship Award and or the Humanitarian Award, whichever it's called, in Iditarod for a couple of things. The first one is about dog care. I think it was at Nikolai a couple of days ago, day before or so, where he left the checkpoint and one of his dogs was not feeling 100%, but he or she was still raring to go in harness. So they took off down the trail, and about 9 miles in, things were just not right with this dog. So he did something that a lot of people wouldn't do, especially 9 miles out. He turned around and went all the way back to the checkpoint to drop his dog. And, most people would just put the dog in the sled bag, which is what they're intended for, then gone on to the next checkpoint. But he wanted to make sure his dog was properly cared for by the veterinarians and took that dog all the way back, which I think is a really cool story and a real testament to dog care. In regard to sportsmanship, I believe it was last night or earlier this morning, he and they said a female musher, we're assuming that is Victoria Hardwick because they've been traveling together for the last few days. But it's my understanding that that a lady, again back to Victoria, had fallen off her sled and lost her team. And Dakota came upon her and picked her up, and they searched for the team together. And eventually reunited the dog team and the lady, and they went on their way. And that's typical musher behavior, typical Iditarod behavior. But a lot of times, especially when everybody's just in that race mode and that competitive mode, they will, kind of do a flyby by these mushers and say, hey, is everything okay? And often they'll say, yeah, if you see my dog team or whatever, flag them down, set the hook or whatever, and I'll catch up, because often they aren't too far down the trail from the dogs, and then of course they will reunite and move on. But he went out of his way to help this lady find her dog team, and of course lost some precious minutes because of that. Now, again, he is in the back of the pack and potentially in for the Red Lantern as we sort of talk right now. But that shows real sportsmanship, doesn't it, Tony?
It does. And like you said, it's something that the mushing community, we hear that story every few races. When you were telling the story, I was thinking back to, I think it was 2019, and it was Linwood Fiedler who fell asleep and fell off his sled, and another musher came up on him, and he didn't know how long he'd been down. He didn't wake up, he said, right as he hit the snow. He must have been really tired. And so they picked him up and they went running after the dogs. I've been there at the Testamina 200 when that's happened. And that's always terrifying because some of that race runs right along the Sterling Highway, and that's what everybody thinks is there's a mad dash to make sure that team doesn't get anywhere near vehicles. But it's all about the dogs. There's so many variables that could go wrong if they're not with a coach. Just like if you let, I don't know, peewee baseball players just do whatever they wanted to without some sort of direction. So, it's a race, but it's really about celebrating the dogs and the culture and the lifestyle. And in order to do that, you have to protect it, and you have to protect each other and support each other. And so the race is secondary when something like that happens.
So for folks that are new to the sport and or Iditarod, the first rule in mushing, as they say, is don't let go of the sled. That's sort of what they teach you the minute you step on the runner. So that is always in the back of our mind, and I'm telling this as a musher's perspective. But in case this does happen and you let go or fall off or get knocked off or whatever, I know from vast experience that the dogs do not care if you're on the back of the sled or not. Most dogs will just continue to run and run and run. And often what stops them is either they get tangled or the sled tips over and gets caught in a rut or something like that. But otherwise, they don't stop. And another thing to note is often it's not just a single trail, and you'll often see in pictures or video where it's just a really nice cut trail. But in a lot of these well-traveled areas, especially on the rivers, there could be dozens of trails where there's offshoots and turns and all sorts of other things that can happen, and a dog team will follow its nose. So if another dog team ahead of them took a wrong turn, or a trap line musher or whatever took off down that route, it's very the case that dog team could as well. I don't think that's what happened here, but it's a very common occurrence, and there is nothing more terrifying for a dog musher from when they fall off that sled and see that dog team going further and further and further away from them. You feel utterly defeated. Not only do you have to necessarily walk to where you have to be to catch up with your team, but just the connection that is lost between them is. Tony, what is the story about the Rainy Pass ponies? What's happening with that?
This is the best story, I think, of this year's Iditarod, because no one thought that this was going to be an issue. Most of us didn't even know that it even existed. But as we talked about the other day, Rainy Pass has 18 or 20 horses. I think they're actually ponies that they've flown in over the years and that they use for guiding in the fall. And then the rest of the time, the horse is basically free range. And when the Iditarod comes through Rainy Pass, it's the only checkpoint that they send out hay bales instead of straw bales, so that when the dog teams go through, the horses can essentially snack on what's left over, and there's not a worry that they're eating something that they shouldn't. I think the problem is those horses are so used to the schedule that nobody really thought that, hey, these horses are just going to expect to be able to get the hay after these guys are gone. And so on the return trip, they were having to fend off the ponies with these hay bales, waiting for the mushers to come back towards the finish. And so they put up an electric fence. The ponies have apparently broken that electric fence so many times to get to the hay and just mess with the dogs. Dallas has told the story of trying to fend off 18 ponies while he's trying to let his dogs rest. And so they closed the checkpoint. Sarah Stokey from Turning Heads Kennel reported that they closed Rainy Pass sometime either last night or this morning, And so all of the mushers are basically grabbing their gear from their drop bags and the hay, and they're going about a mile or two past the checkpoint to camp and rest their dogs, because the ponies have gone feral and they are demanding payment for passage. And it's like the bully on the playground. They're going to just shake all of the hay out of the dog fur. So they've just decided, we're tired of fighting these ponies off. Let's just call it a day, which I think is probably the smart thing to do. But this has literally been my joy for the last 24 hours, is just thinking about Iditarod dogs fighting off ponies just so that they can sleep.
You know, a lot of things are going through my head as you tell this story. First off, it reminds me of some kind of Game of Thrones type scenario out there with people fighting off ponies with ski poles and all that sort of stuff. And secondly, they aren't called beasts of burden for a reason, and that seems to be what they're doing right now. And thirdly, and I think most importantly, the other night we learned about Hal Hansen being a horse whisperer, and it's sad that he won't be able to do his magic when he arrives in Rainy Pass in a day or so. All right, Alex, what is our next story?
So the next story is Jessie Royer, when she finished, told about how she and Jeff Dieter had a close encounter with a moose just outside of Skwetna. And she was coming along, and she spotted Jeff, who was stopped there with his team, and there was a very belligerent moose who was not happy about having all of these dogs and two mushers who were suddenly intruding on where he was hanging out, and felt like this was his area. So she got there, and apparently Jeff had been trying to scare this moose away and dealing with the moose for about a half hour or so. And Jeff said, well, do you have a gun? We can fire the gun in the air and scare the moose. And she didn't have a gun. So the two of them were banging on their cookers and banging on anything they could do to make noise with their axes to try to scare the moose away. And the moose just wasn't having anything of it. And she was advancing on the moose and trying to get the moose to back off. And it took them both a half hour after she got there, so about an hour for Jeff, to actually get this moose to move off the trail so that they could continue onto Skwetna. And my understanding is they were not very far away from Skwetna. They were maybe within 3 or 4 miles. And then just, rather than getting settled in so they could do their mandatory 8-hour rest and get ready for the finish, they had to spend all of this time trying to get a moose to leave them alone so they could continue down the trail.
And Alex and Tony, you probably saw my post a couple of weeks ago about our really aggressive moose that we had in our dog yard. She was down there stuck in between the dogs and our barn down there for 15 hours, and she would not move, and she was charging us and really aggressive and huffing and puffing and doing the whole 9 yards. And sadly, it took the Alaska Fish and Game to come out, and they unfortunately had to put the moose down. But moose are not what you see on television. They are not the cute, cuddly cartoon animals that a lot of people perceive them to be. And Tony, I know that living in Kenai, and Alex, I'm sure you're very aware, moose are very, very dangerous up here, especially in the winter. They are by far our biggest threat to mushing in terms of wildlife. Is that right?
Most definitely.
So, we have some plush moose in our house, and they're very cute. But the real ones are, first of all, a lot bigger than you would think. And you have an animal that's anywhere from, I guess, 600 to maybe 1,200 or 1,300 pounds, who is very slow and strong and used to getting his or her way.
Yeah, slow and strong until you piss them off, and then it's all business. And I know that for an absolute fact, for sure. So, Tony, do you have any other stories before we turn it back to Alex?
I don't think so.
Alex, do we have any more, or can we get going on our Musher profile? But before we do, we always talk about the back of the Packers, and it looks like right now, 30th place, Susanna Tuminelli, Sean Underwood, 31st, Hal Hansen, 32nd, Larry Doherty, Will Troshynski, Dakota Schlossler, and Victoria Hardwick, at least on the Iditarod.com standings. Has any of that changed since we started?
A little bit. Victoria and Dakota passed Will, who was stopped for a couple of hours, and then he started up again, and then he seems to have stopped again about 20 minutes ago or so. So Will is currently in the Red Lantern position, and it looks like Dakota and Victoria are both at Finger Lake.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and those 4 or so mushers have been leapfrogging each other back and forth for the last couple of days. So I think the fight, if there is one, and again, nobody really wants the Red Lantern, but the Red Lantern musher is definitely one of those guys or gals, and it's really going to come down to those last few miles to see who it is. Isn't that right?
Yeah, definitely. And it looks like they are all making good progress. Sometimes it's a little bit hard to tell because a lot of them have been not staying in checkpoints but camping along the trail. So one musher might have completed a run or gone as far as they plan to go and will stop for 5 or 6 or 7 hours, and then the others will pass him or her.
Speaking of these guys that are in the back of the pack, we have another rookie musher profile. I think a majority of our profiles this year have been rookies. So I guess, Alex, you have a real affinity to these back of the packers, and that's nothing new. Typically, when we do these profiles, it's of people that most Iditarod fans don't know a whole lot about. And tonight we're talking about Will Truschinsky. Is that right?
Yeah. So Will is 35. This is his first Iditarod. He was born in Montana, sort of grew up a little bit there, a little bit in Alaska, left for a few years to go to college, then came back to Alaska. He was a handler and worked with Martin Boozer back in 2000, and credits Martin for teaching him about dogs and dog care and the importance of teamwork and the importance of treating the dogs well. He's notable this year for a number of things. For one, he's running an all-female team, and that is not unheard of, but it's unusual to have either an all-male or an all-female team. Typically, there's a mixture. I'm not quite sure why he's running an all-female team. My guess is that those are the dogs that were the best prepared for Iditarod, and that's why he chose them. There's a great interview for people who have the insider that he did in McGrath, and most of the musher interviews on the insider are a couple minutes long. Some of them are like 5 minutes long. This one is about 18 minutes long, and it's just wonderful because he is he's so passionate. He's so personable. He really he really comes through what a smart and nice and interesting person he is. One of the things that he said in this interview is he was asked about moose encounters, and he said, and this is my favorite quote of the Iditarod, he said, "I've seen nary a moose on the trail." And I love that. A number of other people picked up on that on Twitter. And his kennel, one of the people that is one of his supporters is, I believe, a graphic designer, and they designed these nary a moose T-shirts for Will's kennel, which you can now buy at his kennel site, which is ATAO Kennel. He also designed and built his own sled, which he did just a couple of weeks before the race began. And one of the interesting things that he has is that his snowshoes, which are required item that you have to carry, he has mounted on the outside of his sled. So rather than taking up a lot of room inside the sled bag, he's got them on the outside. And the snowshoes have spikes on them, and he's aligned the spikes so that they're facing outward, which means that if the sled tips over, it will stop more quickly because he has these extra spikes that will be, going into the snow or going into the ice. He described the Iditarod as a perfect opportunity to make stuff and invent and build things, which I think is just a really wonderful attitude to have towards this. He had done a number of 300-mile races and a number of qualifiers a few years ago, and then did a bunch more as he was preparing for the Iditarod. He and his husband Sean moved to the Fairbanks, always talks about them, and then finishes by saying onward, which I think personally is a great, great message. Now, on his blog, he said that ATAO doesn't actually stand for anything, that A stands for adventure and O stands for onward, but the T and the A in the middle can stand for pretty much anything that you want. His team this year consisted of Annie, Aurora, Belle, Cassidy, Emmy, Furiosa, Marnie, Nala, Ophelia, Rebel, Ray, Rogue, Sundance, and Zenny. And he is currently running with, he had to drop Ray in Nikolai, who had a sore right side, but then is in Anchorage and is doing fine. He dropped Sundance and Cassidy more recently. Sundance was tired and just was done and wanted to go back. Cassidy had a sore hip. They are both doing very well in Anchorage. And the other thing that I wanted to mention about Will is that Will is openly trans. And if he completes this Iditarod, he will be the first openly trans musher to finish an Iditarod. Quince Mountain, our buddy, is also trans and ran last year but did not finish. And I remember back a couple years ago, Will came out as trans on Twitter. And when he did so, he was very worried that he would get a lot of abuse and that he would be subject to, to just bigotry and all sorts of negative stuff. And what ended up happening is, in fact, he got a tremendous amount of support. And his followers on Twitter generally go by the hashtag Buddy Brigade, and he has a very large and dedicated following on Twitter. He's very, very active on social media, both on his kennel and on his kennel page, has a blog, and on Twitter and on Facebook. And when he was in McGrath doing this interview, he made a point of apologizing to his handler, who was in Anchorage, saying that he was sorry that she hadn't had a lot to do because he still had all of his dogs and hadn't dropped any. So she was sort of waiting around for him to drop the dogs. And then he made a point of thanking his social media people, which are referred to as the away team, who post while he is doing races. And I don't want to speak too much about it or get too political. I will say that I think it's very important that people have someone who looks like them and someone who represents them. I think that him running the Iditarod and Quince running the Iditarod is going to be something that will be tremendously meaningful to people who are trans. And I will just say this about all of that. the dogs don't care. The dogs don't care at all. The dogs don't care if you're male or female. The dogs don't care, what your sexuality is. The dogs don't care what color your skin is. What the dogs care about is, are you a good dog person? Do you take care of them? Do you, are you a good team member, and are you a good leader when they're on the trail? And that's what's important to the dogs. And again, I don't want to be too political about this, but I think there's a very important lesson to that. I am really, really happy that Will is running this race, and it looks like he is going to finish this race. And more importantly, it looks like he is going to have a great experience, and his dogs are having a great experience. So that is tonight's Musher profile, Will Troshynski, who is currently in the Red Lantern spot, and he is about 19 miles out of Finger Lake, has another 126 miles until he completes the Iditarod.
Thank you, Alex. I'd like to stick with this for just a minute or two longer. I know we're over time, but this is kind of an important part of the show. You talked a little bit about Will and his social media profiles and how active he is. And as you know, and as Tony knows, this is something relatively new. We talked a lot about how the ugly dogs took over Twitter by storm the last few years, especially with Blair Braverman and Quince Mountain, and they're really followers of that group. But also they've started this movement on Twitter, and now folks like Will have that same social media charisma, if you will. And I find that pretty engaging, and it's really interesting how it's changed the sport in the last few years. Twitter is often seen as a toxic place, and you'll often see that on Facebook as well, especially in the comments section. But usually on these Twitter feeds, in particular about Iditarod, it's almost an always positive place. To talk a little bit about your thoughts about that, and then we'll go to Tony before we close.
Yeah, I think that there is, you're right, there can be a little bit of toxicity on Twitter, or a lot. But Musher Twitter tends to be almost always positive. And I think part of that goes back to one of the things that I love about mushing, which is that, we all have our favorites. We all have the teams that we would like to win. But unlike other sports, unlike in baseball, where Yankee fans hate the Red Sox and they just want the Red Sox to lose, and that's all they care about. And the Celtics fans in basketball just want the Lakers to lose. But I think in mushing, and it's not 100%, but I'd say it's very, very close to that. Most people who are fans of mushing, we want everyone to do well. We want everyone to finish. We want every dog to be happy and well and have a great experience. We just want, our favorites to do a little bit better. And I think there's a kind of positivity to that is inherent to being a fan of mushing. And I mean, you spoke about, when we were talking earlier about the thing of a musher picking up another musher and essentially giving them a ride when their team had gotten away from them. There's a sense that everyone has that they're doing something really, really difficult. And in doing something really difficult in, temperatures that can go 70 degrees below, there's a sense that anyone who's doing this has accomplished a great deal. And so people want to root for each other and maybe root a little bit more for their favorites, but they want everyone to do well. And I think that is something that is really so apparent to me with both the Ugly Dogs and Will's fans, the Buddy Brigade, that they are, sometimes some of them use the hashtag Twitter of Good, and they really bring an enormous amount of energy and positivity to the sport. And that's something that I just really love.
Tony, what are your thoughts about the social media phenomenon with mushing and the Iditarod?
It's taken a long time, I think, for mushers in general to embrace social media. And there are reasons for that. I think there are, it's the whole control the narrative. Do we really want to bring in more stress into our race season by dealing with comments and maybe some of the trolling that we do see happen? I think more, again, on Facebook than we have really on Twitter, at least in the last couple of years. And even when the more, as Alex put it, radical animal rights groups hit Twitter, like I got hit the other day by a guy who was clearly trolling. He just wanted to get a fight going. He wasn't into having a dialogue, but instead of just going into a militant style of, go away, troll, the fans were wanting to engage because a lot of them came to the sport, yes, through Blair or Quince or Will, but they came with reservations because all they had seen were the little PSAs and hit pieces from some of the very financially stable animal rights, quote unquote, groups. And they asked questions, and they were very, very thankful and very, very excited that these mushers that they were reaching out to were willing to have that discussion. And I know mushers have always been willing to have that discussion. I worked in a kennel where it was like, if you have any concerns at all, please come visit us. We will let you see our dogs. We will answer all of your questions. This is not us just saying, hey, give us your money or whatever. If you truly do care and you want to see up close and personal, we'll take that time and we'll have that dialogue. And that, I think, has really helped the social media, especially on Twitter, just the openness of the mushers that are there. And they're willing to answer those hard questions or those really confusing questions. And sometimes I still sit there. I know a lot of people that follow me, they consider me somewhat of an authority or I guess an encyclopedia or something. But even I sit back and I'm like, I just want to have that emotional response. That's just who I am. I'm just going to be like, well, you're dumb if you don't believe it type thing. But to see that dialogue happen between the musher Twitter, as it's called, and the fans, which it seems to meld now, has really, I think it's really going to help the sport in the long run. The transparency, if you want to call it that, or just the openness and the willingness. This is the way that we communicate now. And even older mushers are getting into the social media scene. So it's nice to see.
It'll be interesting to see how it plays out, and I'm interested to have a little bit of a discussion on our last night together about what we think is the future of Iditarod and the future of the sport. We always talk about that, Alex and I, on our show, and this is sort of the close of another year, so it'll be interesting to get all of our perspectives on that, and I'm sure our...
Will's Kennel put out a great post, I think last night or earlier today, congratulating Dallas and talking about all of the people who finished in the top 5 and went out of his way. I assume it was Sean who posted this, but whoever did it went out of his way or her way, their way to name all of the dogs on all of the teams that had finished. And on our show to focus more on the dogs because, as we always say, it's all about the dogs. So that was just very cool to see. And, like I said last night, no matter where someone finishes, if you finish the Iditarod, that's a big deal.
Excellent. So with that, guys, we will be back tomorrow. We should have a majority of the teams in by then. I know that those back of the packers still have that 8-hour rest heading into Squintna, but I'm sure that they will take that in the next 24 hours or so. So we could have a finish by tomorrow. We will see. With that, make sure you join us tomorrow night. And on behalf of my co-host, Alex Stein and Tony Ryder, this is Robert Forto for Dogworks Radio. We will see you guys next time. Goodbye.
From Dogworks Radio, this is Mushing Radio. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and we invite you to subscribe in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. You'll find a link on the episode notes. You can tap or swipe on the episode cover art, and you'll see some offers from our sponsors. You can support our show by supporting them. If you like what you have heard, we would love it if you could give us a 5-star rating and tell your friends how to subscribe too. Your hosts are Alex Stein and Robert Forto. Our producer is Robert Forto, created for Dogworks Radio.